Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hutchinson. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank particularly the organizers who I know have worked really hard to put this on, so thank you very much. I want also to mention that there will be a longish question time at the end. I won't speak for terribly long, maybe 35 or 40 minutes. So as we're going along, please do think about the questions you want to ask, and we'll have a time of question and answer later. Also, I'll probably feel rather enclosed behind this podium, so I might, step forward. I might even come off the platform. So if I do, provided I'm still upright, it'll be okay. I particularly love the T-shirts that have been seen around on campus recently. But what on earth is this phrase, monopolizing knowledge? Monopolizing knowledge is actually for the title of my book, okay, so thank you for the promotion. But it refers to the idea of scientism. Scientism, defined shortly, is the belief that all of real knowledge is science. Or to put it another way, science is all the real knowledge there is. And scientism is at the heart, I believe, of this question of the relationship between faith and science. And it's part of the misunderstanding, particularly, of this topic. And that's why I think it's so important, and that's why I'll spend quite a bit of my time talking about scientism and trying to understand it. My book explores this in much more detail. It looks into the history of scientism, the extent to which it is or is not justified, and in particular the distinction of scientism from science itself, and what's more, the cultural consequences of those. Now, when I bring up this topic of scientism and explain that it is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, I find that there are kind of two extremes of response to this. On the one hand, there are those who say, that's obviously false. And there are others who say, well, that's obviously true. And when you get those opposite extremes, well, there's a little bit of a puzzle going on here. And why is it that people are able to respond in these different ways? Now, if you're on the side of this is obviously false, how could anyone possibly believe this? I thought it would be useful to say that there are people who really believe scientism, and just give you a few examples. Here's an example from Richard Dawkins' book from 6 years ago. In about 6 different places, he says, the existence of God is a scientific hypothesis like any other. And the reason he says that, of course, is because he thinks that all real knowledge and all of these questions are to be decided by science. And yet, it seems to me rather peculiar that we would take the existence of God, or any question about God, as being something which would naturally have to be decided by science. Or here's another quote from an author called Paul Fagar. What is reality? Those things and processes identified by well-established fields of science, using theories backed by evidence drawn from systematic observations and experiments. So reality is what is discovered by science. So that's basically saying science is what determines what we know about reality. Just recently, the most clear-cut of these kinds of espousals of scientism comes from a philosopher from Duke University, not too far from here, I guess. And he says, what is reality? Those things and process... Oh, sorry, wrong one. Atheist Guide to Reality. Scientism, first of all, he defines it in very much the way that I defined it. This is the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge. And then he goes on to say that science provides all the significant truths about reality. And if you haven't quite got it, he then says, once you adopt science, you'll also be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge. Okay, well, I guess we've got it. Except, is it true? And how can there be this very stark belief in something which I think to many of us seems most implausible? Well, I think the one way to try to understand how this stark difference of opinion can exist is to think about what we mean by science. And I think this is one of the causes of the misunderstandings, is that the word science, it's understood sometimes with a degree of ambiguity. There's a degree of ambiguity about what we mean by science. On the one hand, you might say, all right, well, if we want to know what science is, we should just look at it, the derivation of the word. And the word comes from the Latin scientia, and the Latin scientia simply means knowledge. So science, some would say, is just knowledge. Okay? And long ago, that was in fact the meaning of the word science. So hundreds of years ago, that was the case. So if you look, for example, in a book from the mid-18th century, such as the famous Encyclopédie, which is one of the most well-known encyclopedias from the time of the Enlightenment, you'll find science defined there as basically any kind of systematic or contemplative kind of knowledge. If you go 100 years later to the middle of the 19th century and you take a writer like Lord Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay, he writes in his history, for example, meanings by science, the growth of human knowledge. So he has this very, very broad view of what science means. It's all of knowledge. And even in the 20th century, the philosopher R.G. Collingwood, in the midst of a work in which he was really trying to criticize and repudiate scientism, even there he uses the word science to mean any body of systematically ordered thinking. Now, if this old-fashioned way of, this old-fashioned meaning of science held today, then I think science would be, practically speaking, a tautology. Because if science simply means knowledge, then it does indeed mean all the riddle knowledge there is, and scientism is true. But the problem is that isn't what we mean by science today. An unqualified word of the use of the word science today generally means what used to be called natural philosophy, the study of nature. It's what we mean by the word science today, by and large, is the modern science that we inherited from the scientific revolution. And that's certainly what I mean when I'm going to be using the word science today. It's also what we mean when we're talking about science and faith. When we talk about science and faith or science and religion, we're not talking about trying to reconcile the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece with the latest economic theory. No, we're talking about the extent to which one can reconcile a religion such as Christianity with the modern understanding of physics, cosmology, natural history, biology, geology, and those kinds of topics. And this whole question of science and faith is a burning issue precisely because natural science has enormous epistemological prestige based on its amazing growth and success. So science has terrific intellectual persuasiveness and standing in our society today. If science still meant just any contemplative systematic knowledge, then theology, for example, would still be a science. It would make sense to talk of theology as a science. But we don't mean that by science. Theology might not be the queen of the sciences, but it would still be a science. But today, science doesn't mean that. And I am very comfortable saying that theology isn't a natural science. Now, what are science? What is science? What are really the sciences characteristics and what are the things which we understand to be science? Well, I would say science is best understood by its characteristics rather than subjects of study. And the distinctive characteristics and strategies of science are things like these. They're observation, experiment, measurement, systematization, mathematization, self-consistency, etc. And I think these can all be boiled down into two main characteristics, which I refer to as, and I'm going to expand on these in a minute, reproducibility. That means that you can do repeatable experiments or observations, and if you get the same result, that convinces you that you are on the track of genuine natural science. And the second characteristic is what I call clarity. I'll use a capital C to show that I'm using this in a rather specialized sense. But this is basically to do with the fact that science insists upon unambiguous descriptions, which often means measurements, classification, and mathematics. And the main point is that having these characteristics, insisting upon these characteristics, implies that science's scope of application is limited. Not very narrow, but at least not infinitely wide, and there are some restrictions on the things that science can study. Now let me come and expand a little bit more on these two characteristics. First I want to talk about Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday was a wonderful character in the history of science. He was active in the first part of the 19th century, and he had practically no formal education. He left school at age 13 and had no formal education thereafter. He was apprenticed to a bookbinder and learned most of what he learned through reading the books in Mr. Rebo's shop. But he rose to become the foremost experimental scientist in those heady days when electricity and magnetism and chemistry was being developed. And Michael Faraday used to say of himself that he had the most active imagination. He could imagine the Arabian Nights as soon as anything of science. But he said, but facts were important to me and saved me. And he explained this by saying, without experiment, I am nothing. And it was said of Michael Faraday that when he would hear of the latest report, perhaps in a journal article or by a letter, of a new phenomenon in electricity or one of the other topics that he was interested in, the first thing he would do is he would rush down to his own lab and try to reproduce those results in his own lab. And this woodcut of Faraday's lab in the Royal Institution, I like to think, represents Faraday going down and trying to reproduce the results that he'd heard about. Why? And of course he did that because he understood in his bones that reproducibility is the primary characteristic that drives science as we understand it today. By the way, did that make him an arch skeptic? On the contrary, he was a lifelong Christian. He belonged to the nonconformist Sandemanian church, and for two substantial periods of his life, he was actually an elder in the church, which for that church meant that he was essentially the minister. He spoke at the Sunday services, and he visited the sick and so forth. Now, you might say, well, okay, that's fine for experimental science. We understand that we can do an experiment over and over again, and we need to get the right answer, and that's one of the characteristics of science. But what about a science such as astronomy? You can't do experiments on stars, so how can it be that reproducibility is important for sciences like that? Well, the answer is it is. Let me illustrate this by this photograph. Actually, in 1054, some Chinese astronomers saw a new star in the sky, and it grew brighter and brighter over the weeks and became the brightest star in the sky until eventually it started to fade again. And this was a supernova. Now, if that event observed by those Chinese astronomers was a unique event and had never been repeated and nothing like it had ever occurred before or since, it would be pretty hard to make sense of it. But actually, even though that was a singular event, there are many other supernovae. So actually, we can look at the stars with the telescopes we have these days and see supernovae on a routine basis these days. What's more, even from that single supernova, reproducible traces are left. This is the Crab Nebula. These are the remnants of that supernova, that star that blew up in 1054. What's more, inside of that remnant, there is in the middle a pulsar, giving very reproducible, coordinated phenomena, pulses of radio waves. And what's more, you don't have to be terribly careful, but if you take photographs of this nebula year by year, you will see that it's gradually expanding. And if you measure how fast it's expanding and ask yourself the question, at that rate of expansion, how far back in time would I have to go before it was all together in one spot? The answer you derive is it would be in the 11th century. So there are many reproducible aspects in astronomy. Indeed, astronomy became, in a certain sense, the first science, precisely because of the reproducibility of the behavior of the stars. Reproducibility is important in observational sciences. Reproducibility doesn't just mean some kind of simplistic reproducibility at will. But there are many things in our lives that are not reproducible. History, I think, is the clearest example. Only a tiny fraction of the activities of history are susceptible to the methods that might bear the stamp of natural sciences. How do we know the truth of the statement that Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the steps of the Roman Senate in 44 BC on the 15th of March? Not by reproducibility, it never happened more than once, not by experiment, not by any kind of evidence like that of natural science. And yet, history has real knowledge. History knows a lot about Julius Caesar. It's just not scientific knowledge. You can think about other fields. Economics is a very interesting one. I was living in England at the time when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And she and her government started to implement economic policies which were in accordance with the theories of Milton Friedman. These theories were called monetarist economic theories. And in the popular press, they began to refer to this process as the monetarist experiment. Now just imagine, you're a theoretical economist, and someone is going to do an experiment to try out your theory on a whole economy of a country. Wow, that would be really great, wouldn't it? Now, what was the result of that experiment? Well, truth is, we don't really quite know. Because this was not a scientific experiment. This was not a reproducible experiment. You can't go back and try it over again. We don't know what all of the confounding factors were. And that's not because economics has no knowledge. It's not because economics isn't rigorous. Economics has lots of rigor and mathematics and so on and so forth. But it's because it's talking about aspects of the world that don't behave in this reproducible way that science insists upon. I better not say anything about politics because it's too close to the election. These are not sciences in the sense that natural science is. Now, my colleagues at MIT in these kinds of disciplines will sometimes bristle when I say this, because after all, they call their discipline political science. But they shouldn't, because they bristle because they think I'm belittling their disciplines by saying they're not sciences. But I'm not belittling their disciplines. I believe their disciplines possess knowledge, some of it quite rigorous and certainly very important knowledge. I'm just saying that they aren't sciences in the same way that the natural sciences are. I don't subscribe to scientism. But if people in these disciplines or other disciplines feel they have to turn those disciplines into disciplines which make use of the methods of natural science, in other words, if they have to become sciences in the same sense that the natural sciences are, then those disciplines become distorted by it. Clarity, that was my second characteristic. Clarity is, in a sense, the foundational requirement for the expression and communication of reproducibility. The results, even if not the interpretation of any scientific investigation, have to be expressible in terms that are unambiguous. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If you haven't got an unambiguous way of describing the results of an experiment, how can you tell whether, if you try it again, you've got the same answer again? You have to have that at least that level of clarity, and that is something that we insist upon in science. And that clarity is gained by a number of different strategies. One of them is measurement, of course. This, by the way, is one of the replicas of the standard international kilogram. That's that's essentially the only remaining fundamental unit that is measured by virtue of an artifact. So you need to make measurements to turn physical descriptions into numbers with calibrated units, and that gives you the kind of clarity that we require in science. By the way, though, this isn't just mathematics, but because there are plenty of fields of science that aren't particularly mathematical. My botanist friends tell me, actually today, botany is extremely mathematical because one is involved in genetics and genomics and so forth. But if you think about botany in, let's say, the 19th century, where it was more to do with collecting specimens and so on and so forth, even in those situations, there was a great deal of attention paid to field skills, the collection of multiple and preservation of multiple specimens. All of this was aimed at giving one the clarity that one wants. Or if you think about physiology, for example, physiology is largely descriptive, and physiological descriptions aren't in any meaningful sense mathematical, but they do work very hard to have this kind of clarity that is required in science. But there are many things in our lives and in the world which lack that clarity, and yet are extremely important. Here's a few examples: the beauty of a sunset, the justice of a verdict, the drama of a play, the terror of a war, the love of a woman. None of those topics, I submit to you, can be meaningfully described with the kind of clarity that is required by science. That doesn't mean that they can't be described by science. So for example, if you take the beauty of a sunset, I mean, science can certainly analyze the sunset. It can explain why the sky goes red and why there's a gradation of the colors through the sky because of the scattering from particles and molecules in the atmosphere, and it can describe the light in terms of its wavelengths and all that kind of stuff. So those descriptions can be done, but when science has done that, when science offers that as a description, well, it's kind of missed the point, hasn't it, of the beauty. So it's not that the science is wrong, it simply hasn't comprehended the totality or even the most significant aspects of the topic at hand. I'm going to try and do a little demonstration to illustrate this question of clarity a little bit more. I'm not quite sure whether we get the sound to work. So the question is, what is this event? Now clearly, if we're interested in a scientific description of this event, and let me focus on this young lady over here to begin with, we might say we've got two pieces of copper, actually copper alloy with zinc and various other things inside it, that are disks that are brought together. The electrons in the surfaces of those alloy symbols strike one another. The electrons interfere with one another. They generate stresses in the copper. Those stresses propagate out through the metal, and the metal vibrates, and the vibrations are transmitted to the air, and the air vibrations spread out in the hall and eventually are heard. And that's a perfectly correct description of what happened when that young lady struck those together. Or we could ask about this character over here. Might want to talk about him at an engineering level. He's a guy who's got a hammer, okay? So he's going to hammer on that angle. Maybe he's trying to drive it down into the ground. Well, if we thought that, we would be mistaken. But, those descriptions of course, miss the point of this event. They're not incorrect, and the scientific description is not incorrect, but it's at a level which misses the significance of this. Because, of course, they are part of a symphony orchestra. So that's one level of description. And that symphony orchestra is actually playing a symphony, and that symphony has even greater significance. Actually, in the case of music, it's even more removed from the scientific description, because music meanings really, in a certain sense, aren't even present in the scientific description by itself, in isolation. They only really come to be connected when someone hears it, in the act of hearing, and there's a connection to the human. And they obviously don't possess the kind of clarity of being able to be expressed unambiguously by scientific terminology. In case you're interested, that's the famous Hamlet blow from the end of the Mahler's Sixth Symphony. So that's to illustrate the fact that not only does science miss the point if it focuses at a level which is too low down, too reductionistic, but also there are many, many different possible levels at which one can describe an event. And very often, they all have significant contributions. Finally, in this trying to understand science, let me offer you this following quote. And this is to do with the consequences of those two characteristics of science. This is a quote from the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Jacques Monod. And he says this: "The cornerstone of the scientific method is the postulate that nature is objective. In other words, the systematic denial that true knowledge can be got at by interpreting phenomena in terms of final causes, that is to say, of purpose." Now, I like to use this quote for two reasons. First of all, this is a classic example of implicit scientism, not the explicit scientism that I showed you at the beginning, where people are right up front and say, yes, I believe that science is all the real knowledge there is. People don't usually say that. They usually have a much more implicit scientism. So if you look at the first sentence, you see he's talking about the scientific method. But then in the second sentence, suddenly this has become more true knowledge. So the implication is that scientific method and true knowledge are to be identified with one another. In other words, this is an implicit statement of scientism. But the second reason that I like to use this quote is I actually think it's right. If you interpret this as a statement just about science, not about all knowledge, but as a statement about science, I think it's actually right. It is true that science, as we know it today, deliberately sets aside the explanation of things in terms of final causes, and in part because it's got this insistence on reproducibility and clarity. And because it does that, it sets aside the possibility of purpose or personality from the get-go. So really, ad initio, modern natural science has kind of set aside personality and purpose. And in that sense, there can never be, I suggest, a scientific description of personality and purpose. We have to look for those topics like personality and purpose in other non-scientific terms. Well, let me then make the point that I've been leading up to, which is that scientism and Christianity are in fact incompatible. Christianity says that personality and purpose are at the heart of the universe. And scientism rules them out by presumption, because if it presumes that science is all the real knowledge there is, and science has set aside personality and purpose, then of course personality and purpose are essentially ruled out of court. But in a certain sense, science is incompatible with Christianity also because it's a rival worldview. Actually, it's a rival worldview which has all of the characteristics of common religions. And here are, for example, 5 characteristics of religions Most religions have a justifying narrative history, an integrating cosmology, that is an understanding of how the world is and the way it came to be. It has a way of looking at the world through a kind of filter or interpretive lens. And religions also generally have community of believers, and those believers look to that religion as a source of ethics. Now, I actually have spent the first part of my talk talking about the cosmology and the interpretive lens and filter. I'm going to say a little bit more about the justifying narrative of scientism, but I won't have time in my talk to speak to those, but it has those too. But the point I want to make is that it's true that scientism and Christianity are incompatible, but scientism is also incompatible with a lot of other non-scientific disciplines. In other words, the problem with scientism isn't just that it's against religion, but it doesn't make sense of a whole lot of other, whole array of other intellectual efforts of humankind and the way we know the world. On the other hand, I would assert that science and Christianity are not intrinsically incompatible. They may mutually correct and constrain one another, but they aren't inherently incompatible. And this brings me to the question of the justifying narrative of scientism. There is a common mythology that somehow science and Christianity are and always have been at war with one another. This mythology is part of the justifying narrative of scientism. But actually, the historical facts contradict it. Modern sociological observations also contradict it. And the philosophy and history of ideas contradict it. And I want to speak to those 3 points. I am from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. MIT is the high temple of science and technology in America, maybe even in the world. And as befits a high temple, we have Greek architecture complete with fluted columns. Now, actually, if this was really Greek architecture, at the top of the fluted columns, one ought to have bacchanalian friezes of the drunken orgies of the gods. We don't have those at MIT. Instead, what we have is a list of the names of the heroes of science and to some extent engineering over the centuries. And some would say that the drunken orgies take place across the river in the frats. Some time ago, several of us on the faculty at MIT thought it would be interesting to take this list of names as a kind of representative group of names of the historical heroes of science and ask the question, what fraction of those were Christians? This is, of course, a hard question to answer, but nevertheless, very roughly, the number we came up with is 50 to 60% of those are Christians. Now, how could it possibly be the case, as some have asserted, that Christianity has forever been holding back the progress of modern science, and because it's been at war with science, if in fact 50 to 60% of the great heroes of science were Christians? That's the point about the historical aspects. What's more, if you do sociological studies, particularly of universities, what you find is that if you go to any typical university and you ask what fraction of the faculty have religious commitments or are Christians, and compare that with the population as a whole, well, yes, you do find that academics on average are less religious than the population as a whole. But what you find is, if you go deeper, is that it isn't so much the scientists who are indifferent to religion or don't believe in God. It's actually the people in the sociological or humanities disciplines. But if it were the case that science has disproved religion, or that somehow there's this long-term battle between science and religion and they're completely incompatible, I submit you would expect the opposite to be the case. You'd expect the scientists to be the unbelievers and not those in the other disciplines. So that doesn't seem to hold water either. And finally, let me say, I think that from the point of view of the history of ideas, a very plausible case can be made for the notion that Christianity, far from being adverse to science, was in fact a fertile intellectual climate in which science grew. After all, modern science as we know it grew up in the West, in Christendom, if you like. And so how does this make sense? Well, I think if you think about the Christian and indeed the Judaic view of creation, you may begin to get some hints. And the Bible says that the creation was a free, in a certain sense, contingent choice of a creator. So what that means is if God had choices about the way the world was to be, we can't figure out the nature of the world just by sitting in our armchairs and philosophizing about it. We've got to get out there and make some measurements and actually find out what the world is really like. So that's an encouragement to experiment with science. The Bible teaches that the creation is good, that it's worthy of study. So that's another incentive to science. The Bible teaches that creation and God are not identified with one another, and that means, for example, that you can actually investigate the natural world without fear of violating the divine, which you would be doing if you were in a pantheistic worldview. The Bible teaches that humans have a certain authority and responsibility for creation, and that's an encouragement to understand it better. And the Bible teaches that humans are, in a certain sense, in the image of God, and this is usually interpreted in terms of human rationality, that humans have some pale, perhaps, reflection of the rationality of God. And that is in itself an encouragement to believe that one could actually have some success in the process of trying to understand the creation. So these are philosophical and, in a certain sense, theological encouragements to the work of empirical science. Now, these are not my ideas. There are a number of references down here to people who put forward these ideas for why it was that science grew up in the West, where Christianity held sway. But when you add all these things together, I think it begins to make you suspect that this idea that science and religion are and always have been at war simply doesn't hold water. If we repudiate scientism, I think that begins to help us make sense of the relationship between science and Christianity. What this requires us to do is to distinguish between science and scientism. If we take that view, then we can begin to see that scientific descriptions and other descriptions, whether at a personal, human, or even perhaps spiritual level, can, under circumstances, be simultaneously valid. And I'd like to suggest to you that this is an outlook or an attitude that, in the first place, is philosophically necessary, because, as I pointed out, the arguments that scientism has isn't just with religion, it's with a whole host of human and other intellectual disciplines, regardless of religion. So this is not just special pleading on behalf of religion, or give me space to believe what I want to believe. No, it's not. Secondly, this attitude that scientific and non-scientific explanations can simultaneously be valid is actually part of the historic and scriptural record. The Bible speaks in these terms. So this is not a new idea devised by theists to get around modern science. It's always been the way that people have thought about things. And then finally, it's the historically practiced and recommended approach of actually the Christians and the founders of modern science, who looked at this from the point of view of God's revelation being in the form of two books, the book of God's Word and the book of God's works. And they thought both pointed to God. And if we do realize that, we do take that perspective on board, then what that tells us that if indeed we have a scientific description of an event, maybe it's flashing together two symbols, that doesn't rule out a purpose from that event. And to believe it does is not a logical deduction from science. And what's more, it contradicts our most elementary view of the world. Well, I don't have time to go over all these points, but let me just talk about the notion that seeing scientific and non-scientific descriptions as being simultaneously valid is part of the outlook of Scripture. And the example I want to use is the story of the Exodus. You know, the Israelites fleeing from Pharaoh and crossing the Red Sea. And if you're my age, and probably most of you aren't, but you may well have seen the famous film of Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, and that's the image you have in your mind. This is actually a painting that was developed actually before the film, but if you remember the film, these walls of water and the way the Red Sea parts, and of course Charlton Heston is Moses, is the star Moses, and he's the guy who parts the Red Sea. That's a wonderful image, but what does the Bible actually say? Here's what the Bible actually says. Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. This sentence, which is often omitted, actually says, I submit to you, that there was a natural explanation of the escape, the persistent east wind. But that didn't prevent the Hebrews, or the writer of the Bible, from seeing it as a mighty act of God, as a miracle that the people of Israel were delivered. So, explanations of events in terms of natural, or if you like, in a rudimentary sense, scientific ways, and spiritual ways are part of the Bible's view of things. They can be simultaneously valid. Does it somehow seem less miraculous if there's a natural explanation of the escape of the Israelites? Not much to me, to be perfectly honest. It still seems pretty much of a miracle. Now, those who are not theists often remark about Christians and other theists that they don't really have evidence for their faith. Actually, evidence is only one type of reason one might have to believe in God. And I want to point out that there are many classic reasons to believe in God. In fact, there are many different types of reasons. And the mnemonic that I like to use to remember the 5 categories that I think are the types of reasons one might have to believe in God is A, I, or U. So there are arguments, philosophical arguments. There is evidence, which I'll come back to in a moment. There is immediate or individual experience. There is a kind of intuitive organizing or ordering coherence that the theistic perspective brings to the world. And there are simple reasons of utility. You know, it's good for you to be a religious believer, okay, or whatever. Those are different types of reasons. Now, those who charge religious believers with not having reasons usually focus on the question of evidence. They say you don't have any evidence for God. But actually, I'd like to suggest that's not true. And that one can actually examine the evidence for Christianity. But you have to understand what sort of evidence you would expect to have. If you insist upon the evidence being of the form of the evidence we expect in the natural sciences, then I think you will largely be disappointed. But that isn't the sort of evidence that we should look for. The sort of evidence we should look for is much more like historical or forensic type of evidence. And so I want to finish my talk by asking the question, if science isn't the way we should find out whether Christianity is true, how could you find out? How could you go about evaluating or investigating the evidence? And I'd like to suggest a few ways. First thing is you probably use the primary documents. You'd use your intelligence, you'd bring your intelligence and those things together, and you try to make sense of them. Of course, I'm talking about the New Testament. But one of the things one would have to be sure about doing if you're serious about investigating Christianity is you need to be sure you're not bringing presuppositions to the table that end up dictating the answer you're going to get. If you come with a scientific viewpoint that science is all the real knowledge there is, which might well be packaged up with the belief that, for example, miracles don't happen, then you've sort of started with a presumption that is going to force you to a certain type of conclusion. So you have to come with a certain degree of open mind if you want to investigate this. I would say also this works the other way around. I mean, there are many people, I'm sure, in this room who are Christians who take the view that the Bible is authoritative. We do. Christians, like me, do think the Bible is authoritative. We take it very seriously. But I don't insist, if you want to investigate the truths of Christianity, that you have to believe the Bible is 100% true before you can come to it. That would be equally presuming the answer in a certain sense before you come. So you have to have a certain degree of openness. I would suggest that the way one should do this in the case of Christianity is to focus on Jesus Christ, because Christianity is about him. Was he an historical figure, for example? Are the main texts that we have concerning him more or less what was originally written, or are they hopelessly unreliable because of corruption of the centuries? You could ask yourself that question. You could ask, what sort of life was his? What sorts of teachings were his? Very interesting teachings, actually, not just simply moralistic teachings, teachings very focused on himself. This has been drawn out, for example, by C.S. Lewis and many others. And those kinds of teachings leave us far fewer options for how we would interpret who Jesus really is than many people would think. And the crucial question for most is this question about, did he rise from the dead? That, after all, was the message that those first Christians took away on Easter and on Pentecost thereafter, that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that was what made them convinced. Think about them. Think about those apostles. What did they do? What sorts of lives did they live? What sort of deaths did they die? And does that make sense? What is the evidence? So there are lots of different types of evidence: circumstantial evidence, documentary evidence. Maybe there's a little bit of scientific evidence too. Not much, I suppose, but you wouldn't expect to have very much. Logic, testimony. These are the types of evidence there that I think one might expect. And if there were such a God and such a Savior engaged with his creation, so engaged with his creation, that he desires a personal involvement in the lives of his creatures, how would one discover that? That's, after all, the message of Christianity. I think the answer you have to start with is that perhaps the best way to investigate this might be to be open, indeed, perhaps even to seek that relationship. And that's where we bring, I think, this discussion to the point of faith. Faith isn't the contradiction of reason. It's not the opposite of evidence. It's not believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's simply the presumption, the openness, in some sense, to the possibility that God is real and desires a relationship with us. Thank you very much.
We will now transition into a time of question and answer. We will have 2 wireless mics traveling around the room, and you will have a chance to ask your questions. In the event we do not get to you here, there will be a reception afterwards, and we invite you to stick around, and then you can get the chance to ask Dr. Hutchinson your questions. So online, there was the option to ask a question there. To get this session rolling, we're going to start with 2 of the questions that were submitted online. In the event that you're here and the 2 questions we ask are not the ones that you submitted, don't worry, please raise your hand and you will have the chance to ask that question. So the first one we have, Dr. Hutchinson, is, do you believe in the strict 6-day creation as told in Genesis, Or do you see the 6 days of creation as operating on God's timetable?
Okay, I guess this question is offering me two options. I'm not sure I want to take either of those options, but I want to be quite direct on this. Everything we know about physical science indicates that the world is much older than 6,000 years old, and that the process by which the universe and the world came to be what it is a much more drawn out and dynamic process than a naive interpretation of Genesis 1 would suggest. I think it's a mistake to think of Genesis as some kind of scientific description of the beginning of the universe or of the world. I think that's a misinterpretation. It misunderstands the purposes of Genesis and of the scriptures, which are to teach us much more about the relationship between God and his creation, rather than some kind of scientific or historical description of how it came to be what it came to be. And by the way, that opinion that I just espoused is not a new view. It's what the church has believed essentially throughout the centuries. St. Augustine was very critical of those who would, in an excessively literalistic way, try to interpret Genesis. And though the church has struggled through the years, I would say, with how to interpret Genesis, I think this is one of the areas where I would say modern science corrects and just constrains our interpretation of the Bible. So that's my answer.
Next question is, if one cannot recede far enough into history, I'll restart.
Go ahead.
If one cannot recede far enough into history to find a moment when man was perfect in the image of his creator, does that mean that such a moment never existed?
Okay, so I think this question is really about the fall, the Christian doctrine of the fall, how we understand that, if we think that the universe is old, if we think that perhaps animals have existed on the earth for millions of years and so forth. I think this question is kind of getting at, does that undermine Christian doctrine about a form of perfection and the reflection of a future perfection? My position is that I think the science is pretty convincing that there was, at the very least, animal death before the fall, before whatever is taught about Adam and Eve and their rebellion against God. And I rather suspect that there was probably even humanoid death before that. Does that, and the question is, does that somehow undermine my Christian theology? I don't think that it does. I think there are many ways, or at least several perfectly good ways to understand the fall as being the alienation of humans from a creator that would affirm the reality also of the possibility of salvation, which is of course what Christians talk about and mean when they talk about coming into a relationship with Jesus.
At this point, the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. So we'll take our first one from this side, second from there, and so on. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Just wondering how you do prophetic books in Scripture, specifically the book of Revelation, if you do it as a historical prophecy that was fulfilled with the Roman Empire, or it is still a prophetic book yet to be fulfilled.
Golly, I'm not a Bible scholar, and although I've read the Bible pretty thoroughly and studied in some ways, my own view. So I guess we've had one or two questions about the far past. Now this is perhaps a question about the far future. It's a question about eschatology. I think the Bible teaches that Jesus is going to come again, What form that is going to be in, I don't know. And actually, I think the scriptures teach us that we should be rather cautious about thinking we've got it all figured out as to how prophecy works, and therefore how the future is all going to work out. In fact, there are words about our Savior himself who said, about this, no one really knows the answer. So I take a rather circumspect view of that. I think Revelation is actually a book much more about encouraging Christians in times of persecution and trouble and trial than it is about telling us what the future is going to hold.
Do you have a question from this side of the room?
Push it right up to the top. Yeah, you got it.
All right. My question is about talking about faith, creation, and evolution. My first year here at William Mary, my introductory biology class, the professor was talking about how, in order to actually learn about evolution, you have to accept that there is no purpose in nature. And my question is it do you think it's possible to believe in evolution and still have faith? And is that possible?
Okay, so I would say that if your professor literally said what you just said, he was mistaken. Okay, but I think there is an argument which says this that evolution is a mechanism that acts without any evident purpose. It acts through random variation and through the pressure of selection and so forth. Now the question is, and that's the scientific description or explanation of how animal species came to have the diversity and adaptation that they currently have. But you see, the reason why I started by saying if your professor really said that, he's wrong, is this. He's saying there is a scientific description in terms of evolution. Okay? But I'm saying science is not all the real knowledge there is. And having a scientific description of something does not rule out the possibility that there is a bigger purpose to this. So my view is that if indeed, as I think is probably the case, and the evidence for it is mounting very strongly, if indeed common descent is a fact, and that evolution was in fact the main mechanism by which animal diversity arose, that doesn't bother me. That doesn't rule out the possibility, to my way of thinking, that God has created the universe and planned it. After all, ever since this idea has been around, people have taken the view that it's a perfectly good way of creating to decide that you build something which will end up assembling itself, or in a certain sense, developing itself, which is, after all, what the evolutionary description offers. So I personally have no problem with evolution. I don't think evolution rules out the possibility that God has a plan. It doesn't rule out Christianity. And I think it's a mistake to imply, whether you do so either from a Christian perspective or from an atheistic perspective, I think it's a mistake to imply that it does.
Dr. Hutchinson, thank you very much. Burning question I had to ask for an MIT physicist. It's not often you get the question asked to ask an MIT physicist while I was sort of stalking the mic around the back here. It seems like one of the reasons many professors or scientists tend to lean towards scientism is this idea that everything is determined, that if you go down to the most fundamental levels, at some point there will be an explanation for everything, and it'll all turn into one equation, and then, as you go up up the levels, then it'll, if you have that equation, you'll be able to figure everything out. So some of those types of knowledge will eventually go away. And I'm a medical student at UVMS. We're very excited about the potential of becoming part of the William Mary family. And that's very persuasive in, for instance, the neurological neurologist, that at some point will be able to explain the brain and any aspect of the soul will be explained away. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that specifically.
Okay, so let's draw some important distinctions. You started by talking in terms of determinism. Okay? Determinism, it means it's an old-fashioned idea, actually. It means that somehow if we think that the world is governed by equations and we have the initial conditions of all the equations, we can solve the equations and we can predict the future, and so it's all determined from the initial conditions and there can never be any change. Actually, physics doesn't believe in determinism at all. I mean, these days, quantum mechanics fundamentally shows that the world is not deterministic. I mean, we set out in science to try to understand the world insofar as it is reproducible and thereby predictable. But actually what we end up running up against is a situation where our most fundamental theory of the world says that the best we can do is have probability. So I would argue that determinism, per se, is not a very popular concept and not a very tenable concept within the realms of modern physics or modern science. However, I think what you might have meant is something more to do with what I would call physicalism or perhaps materialism. In other words, the view that there is some kind of scientific description of essentially everything that there is, and that everything that there is can be described by science. Well, again, it comes down to this question: do these descriptions at different levels have equal or comparable validity? You may well be able to describe, we brought up the question, let's say, the brain and neuroscience. You may well be able to describe the brain in terms of physics and chemistry. But does that mean that thought is nothing but neurons and electrons and all kinds of other things? It can't mean that, because if it did, then the very thought that thinks that would be rubbish. So there must be some meaning to meaning, otherwise we can't talk about anything. So I would argue that some kind of reductionistic view, understanding, let's say, of the brain, is in a certain sense self-contradictory. We must take the view that human cognition has some reality to it, has some meaning to it, even if it is grounded and can be in large measure described in terms of physics and chemistry. And so that's, again, consistent with this view. First of all, science isn't all the knowledge there is, and that descriptions at different levels have to be taken as, in some cases, equally valid or simultaneously valid.
Take a question from over here.
You argue that science can't disprove Christianity, but there are some Christian scientists like Francis Collins who would argue that the complexities of the universe can actually give credibility to the existence of a God. Would you agree with that, or do you have a position on whether or not the universe can actually say there is a God?
Yeah, thanks for that question. As I said, there are many different arguments for the existence and reasons for the existence of God. And I haven't, of course, got time to talk about all of them. Yes, I think there are some aspects of science that would lead you in the direction of acknowledging the reality of a creator. And the most elementary that I can think of is that the universe appears to have a beginning. We take this kind of for granted these days, but when I was a student at Cambridge University, one of my tutors was a scientist called Jan Narliker, who was a co-worker with Fred Hoyle. And Fred Hoyle is famous for a lot of things, but one of the things he's famous for was that he espoused the steady state cosmology, the belief that the universe has always existed and will always exist. And that was, in those days, a fading but still viable thought. Of course, what came along was we measured cosmic background, microwave background radiation, and we rapidly realize that there's overwhelming evidence in science that the universe actually had a beginning, which is what we call the Big Bang. The Big Bang, in a certain sense, is perfectly consistent with the scriptural view of creation, the notion that the universe actually had a beginning. And it's a little bit problematic to understand how that came to be if there was nothing before that. So it raises the questions, in a certain sense, of the classic cosmological argument. Why is there something rather than nothing? So I think there are many, many arguments for God, and I think you cited questions of complexity. The complexity is an interesting one. I don't think it's one of the strongest arguments, but there are many such arguments, and they all have different resonances with different people. And I think that they all deserve to be considered. So yes, I think there are some ways in science that lead us towards the idea that there is a God. But I do think that it's a dreadful mistake to insist that science must prove God, or to feel as though we can't believe in God unless science proves it. Because in a certain sense, that's scientism. That's a sort of surreptitious scientism. It's saying that what we really believe is what science says. Okay, so we better have a scientific proof of God, otherwise we're not going to be justified in believing in God. I'm not going to subscribe to that view, because I'm not someone who thinks that scientism is correct.
Question over here.
Christianity seems to be a traditionally mystical faith, with a lot of roots in religious experience and miracles. I was wondering, in your opinion, what can Christianity do to reconcile itself and to give itself more merit in the eyes of those who encourage scientism? It seems that most of secular society only has a fundamental understanding of what Christianity is, and doesn't typically acknowledge the fact that many theorists have worked out the dichotomy, the perceived dichotomy between the two. So what can average Christians practically do to give ourselves more merit in the eyes of those who encourage scientism?
Okay, well, I do think that you're correct that Christianity is inherently, if you like, a miraculous religion. I think if you read the New Testament, you can't escape the notion that Jesus did amazing things, and the whole of Christianity is in a certain sense founded on the resurrection, which is, after all, a miracle. So, if you're a Christian, I think we're stuck with that. And, of course, I'm saying that's somewhat ironically. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. But you're right also to imply that many people will dismiss Christianity because they think they know that miracles don't happen. But they don't know that. They presume that, but they don't know that. And there are many arguments, historically the name of David Hume is associated with some of them, concerning miracles. But none of those arguments really holds any water to prove that miracles don't happen. Science cannot, in my view, prove or disprove miracles. And the reason is because miracles are inherently unusual, out of the ordinary, unreproducible events. And so I would argue that you cannot prove scientifically whether or not a miracle has occurred. You might offer evidence, to reduce the plausibility or increase the plausibility of a strange event being an act of God. You can't fundamentally prove it one way or the other. Well, you say you're saying how can we raise our credibility with those who adopt the view that miracles are a liability? I'm not sure that we can. And I'm not sure that I want to. I want to try to explain to those people that their view of knowledge is narrow and impoverished, that there is more to life and to the intellect and to knowledge than just taking the view that science is all the real knowledge there is. And I want to say that, many of us have had personal experiences which we interpret as being experiences of God, which would come, essentially under the category of a miracle. Perhaps it's not a grand miracle that we would trumpet from the rooftops, but we nevertheless have an experience, astonishing experiences. And probably there are several people who could give testimony to those types of things. So, I guess I'm in the end kind of questioning the premise of the question, which is that we should somehow change Christianity or do something to persuade those who have got a scientific worldview. I think my approach is to try to explain to them, no, actually, the worldview is not correct.
Take a question from over here.
At one point in your lecture, you indicated that science and Christianity constrict and correct each other.
Constrain
and correct each other. I understand what you meant by science constraining religion or Christianity. Can you elaborate what you meant by Christianity constraining and correcting science?
Okay, so let me just give you an example. If you do research in America that is federally funded and involves the use of human subjects, you already are highly constrained to observe all kinds of important procedures, ethical aspects of your research. You've got to practice openness, you've got to tell people about any risks. There are all kinds of constraints about what you can and can't do with human subjects. That's as an example of science being constrained by, in this case, ethics, and much of the ethics of our nation still is an inheritance from our Christian path. Perhaps for many people they would disavow that path, but nevertheless I would argue that it is. So that's an example of ways in which a religious perspective or religious teaching can justifiably, and in this country does already, constrain scientific research. That's an example.
All right, we're going to take two more questions. So one more from this side and one more over here.
Just first of all, I want to thank you for coming out here. I really appreciate you talking. It was really enriching. I know you said you're not a biblical scholar, so I hope this question is still within the realm of your expertise. But you said one of the ways that we can know if Christianity is real is through history and primary documents. So I want to know if you could give your thoughts on divine inspiration and how literally you can read the Bible.
Well, Paul talks about the Bible being inspired. Of course, when he talks about it, he's talking about the Old Testament. But Christians have, throughout history, taken the view that the Bible, the New Testament and the Old, are God-breathed. That's the literal meaning of inspired. And that by some process that we don't completely understand, God caused the people who wrote to write in a way which gave us convincing and authoritative teaching, correction, as well as history, as well as quite a lot of history and prophecy and so forth. My own view is I personally adopt what I would regard as a very high view of the Scriptures. I don't think that a literalistic interpretation of the Scriptures at all points makes sense. After all, when Jesus said, the sower went out to sow, literally, do you mean literally there's a guy out there sowing seeds? No, it's a parable. Okay? So there's lots of things in the Bible that aren't meant to be taken literally. Okay? But nevertheless, we Christians think that they are authoritative. And so we try to seek to put our lives, to match our lives up to those, and we ask, are we matching up to that teaching? The way I like to describe my attitude to the Bible is this. The distinction is between Luther and Erasmus. So Luther wrote a letter to Erasmus in which he said, you know, the difference between us, Erasmus, is that you sit over the scriptures to judge them, but I sit under the scriptures that they might judge me.
All right, one more question from this side.
Thank you. I hope I can phrase this well, but give me just a second here. Basically, what I'm looking for is the answer to the following question, but I'd like to give you a little background first. Jesus made a very difficult statement for many people to accept when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And many people struggle with that. So I want to back up here for just a second. It seems to me, when we look at science and we look at reproducibility and clarity, we live lives where we want certainty. We want to know that 2 + 2 always equals 4. We want to know the periodic table is the periodic table. We want to know that the North Star is the North Star, so that we can build a life on science, on truth. When it comes to issues of the soul and eternity, which seem to me to be extremely important for life, more so than how my GPS system functions, we seem to want a lot more flexibility. We want to be able to have it our own way. We want to build it in our own form. We want to be able to develop it in a way that suits us. So Jesus Christ comes along and he makes this statement, which many people find one of the 3 ways. They think he's a complete megalomaniac, or they think he's completely intolerant. My question to you is, was he making the statement of truth or faith? And is it possible that scientifically he was speaking of a scientific provable fact, and what he was trying to communicate with that is, don't get this wrong. Your soul and eternity is so important. I want to make sure that I'm clear on this point. What's your view on the statements that he made?
Okay, I think I'm trying to understand exactly sort of the nature of your question. One part of this question is about the uniqueness or the claim, the exclusive claims perhaps of Jesus Christ. I think that those exclusive claims very often make people in the West today uneasy. They seem contradictory to our culture of pluralism and acceptance and tolerance. But actually, I don't see it that way. If Jesus really was who he said he was, if Jesus really was the Son of God, is the risen Savior, then it seems to me, these statements are, in a certain sense, statements of fact. I wouldn't call them statements of science. That's where I take slight issue with you. I think they're statements of fact, but I don't think that they're things we could prove scientifically. I think they're things that might represent the truth, but they're not things we're going to do experiments on to find out, whether they're true or not. So I think that it's another of these things where Christianity is kind of stuck with it. But hey, great, we're stuck with it. Because I really do think that Jesus was and is the Son of God, and that's why I follow him. Now, is this intolerant? Is this a violation of today's plural customs? I actually don't think so. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy doing these kinds of events. Because here we are in this room, and I'm sure there are many people out there who are not Christians, as well as many people who are Christians. And we're having what I would regard as interesting and I hope open and fruitful discussion. But we're not insisting that we leave behind us our convictions. I came into this room with convictions, and probably many of you did, whatever those convictions might be. I think true pluralism is the ability to have a meaningful conversation where we really listen to one another, we really say what we believe, and we try to make sense out of it. And so I actually think that Christianity has always, right from the beginning, operated in an environment of pluralism. After all, in the first century Palestine, golly, there were all kinds of beliefs there. So it's not unusual for Christianity to be in this pluralistic culture. And our faith is meaningful within that. So my answer to your question is, I think Jesus is who he said he was. And if he wasn't, then I think you're left with very few options. I think you're left with either he was mad, or he was a deceiver, or he was who he said he was. And that's what I believe. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.